Okay, so we're talking today about how to build MVPs fast, and I'm not doing it alone. I have a great guest. So maybe we just start with a quick intro. Marc, tell us a little bit about yourself, then I'll talk a little bit about myself, and then we can talk about the goals and objectives of this little conversation.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for the invite, Mike. I'm Marc, co-founder of Langfuse. We currently build like an observability package, an open source for people building with LLMs. We got to this kind of problem after iterating with lots of MVPs on the application layer ourselves. Started back in the building space. Lots of MVPs built over the last year. Like what you need to do in pre-prod market fit. Originally a business background, but then always hacking on private projects. So kind of both worlds. Yeah, that's the very short summary.
Okay, great. So I'm Mike, co-founder of Fastgen, second YC company I'm building with my great co-founders, David and Konstantin. The first one was a fintech that did student financing in the US that we'll talk about a little later as well. And maybe you ask yourself, why did I invite Marc specifically for this? Because we're doing webinars regularly and we have lots of different guests. But Marc and the Finto, now Langfuse team, are among the best teams that I've ever seen when it comes to building great MVPs in a rapid fashion. And since we were in the same YC batch earlier this year, I followed them like very, very closely. I saw the MVPs that they were churning out and was impressed basically every single time. So I thought would be a great guest to have. And let's talk a little bit about what we want to do today. So today we want to talk about what even is an MVP and the most important characteristics, and also saying what many people think an MVP is, but kind of trying to differentiate between the two. We'll give you some case studies, most importantly, case studies of things that we have worked on ourselves, like MVPs that we've built, maybe say what went well, what we learned, what could have gone better. And then we also talk about how do you even identify what the MVP should look like and translating it into user scope. Then we lastly, or penultimately, also talk about the tools that we like to use. And then lastly, we talk about the actual topic of this, which is how do you build MVPs very fast? And we can just start by talking about what is an MVP even, and defining like a little bit of the characteristics of what it is. So MVP, obviously, minimum viable product, but what does it mean in practice? So a couple of things that I would like to mention is an MVP, one of the most important things, it solves a core problem. And usually it solves one core problem. It doesn't solve multiple core problems. Maybe if you're a marketplace, you can argue that it's like two core problems, but you don't want to solve too many things in your MVP. You want to solve one core problem. It should provide some level of value to the person who is using it. It's usually not like the biggest value, right? Because you want to build it very fast, but it needs to overcome a certain level of value so that people are actually interested in using it and taking value out of it. And then again, like that comes into like a similar vein. You need enough features to solve this one task. So if you solve half a task or 3/4 of a task, that usually isn't good enough. So you need to work very hard in your MVP to like focus on solving one task. And then you also need to generate some way for feedback. So the MVP itself is not only the sign that you can build it, but it's also the sign that you can generate data from building this product and then using it to decide what you want to do afterwards. Then one of the things that's kind of in the name already, but you can build it quickly. If you build it for a year, it usually isn't an MVP, at least in software, right? If you're talking about hardware or biotech, things are different, but we are talking about software products today. And I think this is one of the most important things about MVPs that people often confuse, which we'll talk about later as well. An MVP should represent a subset of a final product and should not be a stripped down version of the final product, at least if it's a good MVP. So what that means is if your final product that you envision solves 3 different problems, you don't want your MVP to solve like all 3 problems like to 30% or 20%. You usually want it to solve one problem like reasonably well. So for example, if your goal is to build a CRM, a customer relationship management, where you store customer data and enrich it and do lots of other things with it, you should maybe start with just being good at focusing on the lead gen part and then doing data enrichment for account executives afterwards, and then doing data enrichment for account managers afterwards. And you shouldn't do like all three things at once, kind of. That's usually what works best. And on top of that, let's maybe talk a little bit about what the goals of an MVP is. And there I would love to hear what you think, Marc, as well. But I think the main goal usually of an MVP is to validate a hypothesis or to disvalidate it. It really depends, right, how you want to frame it. And in that vein, you want to eliminate risk. And there's different kinds of risks that you can eliminate. On the one hand, you have usually for MVPs demand risks. You want to see, does anyone even want me to solve this problem? That's usually one of the core questions. And you also want to eliminate, depending on what you're building, some kind of technological risk, right? You want to see, can I even build this? Is it possible with our team that we can build something in that space? And you want to understand the space that you're working in better, because actually building stuff and getting user feedback helps you a lot with that. And it also opens up conversations easier if you actually have an MVP that you can show someone and you can dive deeper with your potential customers. I think user acquisition channel was actually something that you mentioned, Marc. So do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, for us, it's a lot about like talking deeply with users. And if you just talk about like concepts and not having built something, it's very difficult to go very deep. I mean, we have kind of conviction and an idea, and we know what the problem is based on like talking to users and being users ourselves. But then scoping it down, getting something out, trying to solve it really helps you understand like who wants this. Maybe some people send it to other people because they know this can be helpful. It's way easier to forward kind of a product than to forward, hey, talk to Marc. Maybe it's interesting to talk about your problem. So this kind of inbound doesn't happen that much if you don't have something to show.
Yeah, and let's talk about this a little more because that's definitely something that I noticed as well. If you ask people for introductions or even talk to people, if you talk to them on an abstract level, like doing user interviews, like which we'll talk about later a little bit, that is helpful. But the whole conversation shifts, even if you show them a click dummy or if you show them a landing page that they can forward. I think the ultimate minimum of getting someone to like help you out in that way is just having some kind of landing page. And you actually sometimes didn't even use like actual landing pages. I think you just used, in quotation marks, Notion docs, where you wrote down what you actually wanted to achieve. Can you talk a little bit about why you did it that way?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, currently we have, for example, a Google Doc publicly on our website with like a design doc for the next iteration of our software, just because it's like the easiest way to forward a link to people to be like, hey, this is what we want to build. What do you think? To keep the message short that we send via WhatsApp or something to potential users and get feedback quickly. Regarding website, it's always about like prioritization. And for us, it was like putting a Notion website on a URL is easy, or currently on our website, it's just like a markdown doc. So it's also super easy. We don't want to kind of waste much time until we know what the core problem is of the product we are building. We don't want to waste too much time on like marketing and website. Yep. Yeah. Maybe to add to the MVP discussion, for us, it's kind of like, what's an MVP? What's a prototype? And what we want to solve for is like validate or like get proof for the core risk that we're trying to kind of understand right now. And sometimes it's like, what's the biggest problem of a particular user? Sometimes it's, is this kind of solution attractive? Then can we actually build it? What's the minimum kind of solution that's already helpful? And it depends, like using the fastest thing is probably the best. So like we try to hold off building because building is fun, but building doesn't, it takes too much time.
Yeah. And how do you figure out which risk you want to eliminate? Because that's often a conversation, right? Is it more about, like, for example, you just said there's multiple options, and usually all of those risks exist to some degree. So how do you know which risk you focus on first with the MVP?
I think it's like for us, like what are we most paranoid about? If I want to, like, for example, I'll book a call with our YC partner and I'll just imagine like what will he ask us, and having this kind of virtual conversation of how can this be challenged the most. This is probably like the biggest risk that we should go for, and usually it's is this the #1 problem that people will pay lots of money for, and is this how we solve it? Is it significantly better than someone else or other solutions in the market? That's kind of like always the kind of biggest risk that we are solving.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, for me, it also depends a little bit on what you're building. So just to give everyone a couple of examples, if you're building something really new and groundbreaking, like if you're at the frontier of technology, then technological risk plays a huge role, right? You need to figure out, can we even do this? Like, is it even possible? And then if you go more into areas where you know that the tech can be built, it's more about, is this problem big enough? Does this problem even exist for my end users? Or can I position it in a way where they understand the value? Because sometimes you can also be very, very certain that a problem exists, but you're not quite sure whether the way you want to solve it is the way they want it to be solved. So I think there's like lots of different angles that you can think about on that area. Let's talk a bit about the misconceptions about MVPs, because I have the feeling that if different people talk about MVPs, different people have different imaginations. So let's start with the first one, because if some people hear MVP, they immediately think that it's a subpar product. And in some areas, that's actually true, right? So usually it isn't super refined in terms of design. It might not be hyper optimized in terms of load times or whatever, but an MVP is never an excuse for delivering poorly functioning products. It breaks in some areas, right? Often. But I think the important thing is, your MVP needs to solve something in a good enough way, or it isn't actually a minimum viable, like the V is very important here, product. Because it doesn't say minimum product, it says minimum viable product. So it needs to like hit a certain barrier. And how do you figure out where that barrier is?
Yeah, I think for us, even when working with developers, it's even more kind of a quality. Quality is even more important. Yeah. We always see like the kind of trade-off between like speed, scope, and quality. And we want to bring scope down to have high speed and high quality on the scope that we try to deliver. But yeah, the minimum, sometimes it hurts. Sometimes you have a feature where you feel like this is kind of minimum, but your co-founders challenge you on, yeah, that's not like, as long as no one asks for it, let's not build it, let's ship it and see what they want. And maybe there's something that's even more important than what you think belongs to the minimum version. Yeah, it's a constant struggle to bring the scope down to ship fast.
Yeah, I know that we have some people in the audience who are working in teams, either at like bigger companies or earlier stage founding teams. And then also some people who just build product on their own. For the teams, the dynamic you just talked about, I know that very well, because we have that conversation every time we're building something new about like how big the scope should be and what we should deliver. And usually the camps, at least in our case, are more or less the same, where like the same people usually want to deliver like a little more, and then other people want to cut the scope a bit more. Is it the same in your team, or does it differ depending on what you're building?
100%. It's kind of always the same. Like,
are you in team cutting, or are you in team building more?
I'm in team. I think during my working hours, whatever this actually is, it's also team cutting. But I like to make things that I'm proud of then when having some time, for example, on the weekend. If I feel like, hey, we could really delight this user by pushing this like 20% better, then I'll probably do it, because like our users, like making them happy is kind of top priority, even though maybe building something or figuring out what the next user wants would be better for the business. Sometimes it's just very gratifying to build something for people you already have as users. But generally, I feel like cutting is the way to go.
Yeah, I'm also definitely usually team cutting, and because I'm always very much team speed, which kind of probably is also related to my role, right? Because like if you're like, I'm CEO, so I care a lot about just like getting stuff out to users, getting the feedback in, etc. And then if you're CTO or CPO, then you are actually building it, and your ego is a bit more, like, not in a bad way, but your ego is a bit more dependent on actually delivering like high quality, right? So I'm usually team cutting or speed, but then I also sometimes get very weirdly important product ideas that extend or feature ideas that extend the scope by quite a bit. So I think it depends a little, but usually I'm more team cutting. Then another point that I never understood where that's coming from, but what some people are also saying, that MVPs are just for startups, and that's just like where we spend a lot of our time, right? Because we're building startups ourselves. But even very big companies have very dedicated processes for building MVPs, and they even have often more sophisticated processes for building MVPs than startups. They might not ship MVPs that break left and right, but they also are thinking a lot about resource allocation and making sure that you test out things. We are not in like 2005 anymore, where big companies are still doing like 2-year-long waterfall projects. They got a bit more agile as well, and are trying to test things. And some big companies are really good at it, and others are not. Then the other point is, like, an MVP is not a binary thing, right? An MVP is more of a state that can change. And like you can't say like on April 2nd, I'm launching the MVP, and then the MVP is done, because the MVP scope and everything can change based on user feedback, based on the data that you get and other things. So how do you usually set deadlines when it comes to building your MVP? And then once you have the very first version out, how do you think about getting to the next MVP version?
Yeah, for our like new feature that we built, we try to get to kind of user validation first without building. And when we know these are like the 5 to 10 people who really want this, then we'd go kind of scope, well, what's the minimum thing to help them with their problem, and then get it out. And usually try to be fast. I mean, we'll get there later, but if you stick to your stack and have done it a couple of times, you can be very fast. And usually you can do it like when you ask like a couple of times, can you do it even faster? You could start first thing you build, you think it needs a month. In the end, probably you can get something out in less than a week. Just because, yeah, it focuses down the scope and gets it out to users. And I mean, as you said, even if you're building yourself, you might get attached to the quality, but only the first times. If you've built something that you love while building and afterwards realized it's kind of useless, then like you fear that moment way more than the kind of intermediary feeling of being proud of like what you've built.
Yeah, you lose the shame a little over time. It's I think a good comparison is, if you've never done public speaking, maybe the first couple of times are really bad. But then if you've launched the like 8th MVP, or even if you've wasted a lot of time on a product for a very long time and you could have validated in like an 1/8 of the time, then at some point you just know that actually shipping stuff as early as possible is very important to protect your time and making sure that you actually build something that people want to use. Yeah, maybe let's, in the interest of time, let's skip some of the other points and just talk about the actual case studies, because I think that will probably be interesting for people. And let's see. So I just put in 2 screenshots of like exemplary, like very successful products that had very interesting MVPs. And what I just want to mention here is that, for example, Facebook, most people here probably don't use it that much anymore, but I think we all used it a while ago. And Facebook launched with like very much not the same that it developed to over time, right? The like button didn't exist. You could like, the only thing you could basically do is like add a friend. And it was mostly just a collection of profiles of people who were at your university, and then it just evolved over time. But it did something really well. And the thing it did really well is like see who else is in your class and connect with them very quickly. And then Twitter actually is interesting. Probably many people know the story, but at first they couldn't really gain traction. And then they were at South by Southwest. I don't know, was it 27? I don't remember the exact date, But basically, they had this like big breakout moment where users started flooding the platform. And in the very early days, it also looked very different, did have way less features. But maybe more interestingly, let's talk about how the MVPs that we built. So the last company that our co-founding team did, and actually some of the engineers that we hired at Fastgen also joined at some point, was this one. And I need to give a little bit of context here. So we were running a student financing company. And what we did was we offered college students in the US the ability to sign up on our website and then get a quote where they would get a certain amount of money. And in return, they would pay a percentage of their income when they graduate, but only if they earn more than a certain income threshold. So there were a lot of stakeholders involved, right? There were the students, there were the investors, because we needed to like get money from some people that we could give the students, and then they would repay it over time. We needed to have software for the students, we needed to have software for the investors, and then we also needed something for the schools. And then we also had regulation and lawyers involved because we need to draft all the contracts. So how do you even start? So what we did, the very first thing we did, before we even started building, we went to college campuses around California and just started talking to college students and asked them like how they finance their college, and just try to understand whether they would use something like this. And then the next thing was the MVP that we built. And this isn't even one of the very first things that we launched, because I couldn't find it anymore on Wayback Machine. So this is one of the first things that I found. And what we did there was we tested demand on the student side. So we had this like landing page where students could sign up for a waitlist to get funded by a certain date. And the demand from the student side was like very, very, very high. So we saw very quickly that students wanted this, that students wanted the risk alignment. And at the same time, we needed to have built like a forecasting model, because we need to give them some specific pricing. So we needed to have a model of how should we price this, how much should we offer the students, and which students should we decline, because it doesn't really make sense. For example, if they've already defaulted 3 times on different things or already have 500K in debt, then it's probably not a good fit for this. And then on the other side, we were working on getting investors on board to fund the students. So it was not necessarily a marketplace, but something like closer, where we need like 2 sites. And then we didn't have a student portal. So students couldn't really like, they could onboard, but they couldn't sign up and see anything in the beginning. We just did it via email, and we talked to them on the phone even. And then we also didn't have a servicing portal, meaning that the investors couldn't really see what their money, where their money is flowing. So we did all these Excel sheets for them. And we also didn't have any servicing software. Our servicing was basically done in Google Sheets, and we would just charge the students and like send the money manually in the very early days. And over time, we built all of it. We built a student portal, we built an investor portal, we built a very sophisticated portal for the schools. We built this tech for automating payment flows. That was actually like the biggest asset that we had, because we automated basically the whole process, but not in the very early days. Like we started very small, and basically the first thing was a landing page, a forecasting model in the background, and a Google Sheet. And the contract that we got from the lawyers at some point that we couldn't draft ourselves, because you don't want to give anyone money if you don't have a contract. So that was the MVP of the fintech that we built. And now the MVP that we were building is very different for Fastgen. So where we started with Fastgen was we built click dummies in Figma, because the problem that we encountered with Fastgen is it's very difficult to build a minimum viable product if you're building a backend builder, because you need to build a lot of things so that it actually provides value to your users. So the very first thing we did was just build click dummies, see if people would actually like clicking together their backends, and just figuring out whether they would like. I think I might have actually shown you a click dummy back in the day. I don't remember, or maybe I showed you just the. Yeah. Okay. Good. And then when we launched the product, we launched it without some pretty important features that now are a very, very important piece of the platform, and that people say are some of the most important features that we had. So when we launched earlier this year, we launched without a debugging mode. So you couldn't really debug within Fastgen. You had to use external services to do that, which makes it much more difficult to build things. We also launched without logging. You couldn't really see your previous runs. And we launched with a very bare bone version of the API builder and the database. So many things that you can do now, you couldn't do. Workflows kind of worked, but not really. So in the weeks and months since we launched that product, we added so many features. But what we did is we built a version where people could do the very basic thing. They could set up a database, they could store the state of their information, and then they could build APIs on top of it to communicate with the front end, with other APIs, which is like the core functionality of what we had back then. And then, like again, since we are also working with mostly technical people, the quality barrier is a bit higher than if you work with, like if you sell to salespeople or HR people or something, because developers are always like, well, I could build this myself, or they just have a very different view of looking at things and are also expecting higher quality. So we did, even if we had, like when we had the minimum viable product, basically, we didn't launch publicly for 3 more months, but worked with a handful, like 20 beta customers, to refine the product, to make sure that it works, to add new features. And then we launched our public beta, like now roughly a month ago. And when we thought that it actually provides enough value for the broader public. And now we have like way more users, way more feedback, like new people from like all over the world signing up every day, which makes it much easier actually to decide what you're building next, because you have way more data on that. But yeah, it was like a step-by-step process. And at every step of the way, we're like, okay, does this work? Apparently it seems to work. So we should get to the next step, and then moved on from there. But yeah, I think you also brought a couple of MVP examples, and your MVPs, since you also built different businesses, were again a bit different from what we're doing. And maybe like before you jump in, one quick thing, and we can talk about that a little at the end as well. A different company or a different product requires a different MVP. There's not like one silver bullet. You, like, depending on who you sell to, depending on what you're building, you need like slightly different approaches to how you approach your MVP building. And partly also what your team is composed of and what skills you have. So, but yeah, let's see. Tell us about your MVPs.
Yeah, I thought the most interesting MVP is probably the one that we've built initially for Finto, which was our initial company that we started out with at the end of last year, where we solved billing for software companies, where the core issue is integration of the quoting part, where sales reps can create like custom contracts while wanting to price like usage-based. So you need some kind of feedback from the product, how much the product is actually used, because then you, for example, want to pay or charge by API call or some other usage metric. And many software companies want to scale with product-led growth as well. So maybe wanting to do like an enterprise deal first via sales rep, but then letting the user expand their own contract from within the dashboard. So the complexity rises a lot in billing. And our initial plan was to kind of aggregate these 3 pillars: usage metering, sales contracting, and billing into one like more suite-like solution, where at the point of talking to people and having had the problem myself while working in revenue operations, the core question was, is this actually like buildable? And how do the integrations between these kind of 3 pillars work best? And we had some early users who were excited about kind of working with an initial version of what we built. So we had 2 options: either build a software-based solution where you run into all the problems that you just mentioned, because billing is kind of similar to software engineering. There's a high cost of getting it not right, and fixing it manually is kind of, it's very difficult. So we knew that we need to kind of, the high risk part needs to be engineered well, and everything else is just like, I would say like CRUD interfaces. You create some entities and databases and display them. So that's easy, but it takes time if you build it yourself. So what we did was using Airtable, because I think last year or the year before, I don't know when, they launched these no-code UI interfaces, where basically a UI, which is drag and drop, sits on top of this Airtable database. And then you can launch own extensions similar to like PowerPoint plugins. you can launch extensions into Airtable that you can deploy, like write in TypeScript, or for example, in our case, we used it to then run the complex billing logic. While I think the only service that we deployed next to Airtable was like a PDF generator, because in the end, our users wanted to have like sales quotes and PDF invoices, which we then called from this extension. But all the UI interfaces our users really clicked on and used were basically these Airtable no-code UI building blocks. You can go to the next slide, because I brought like another screen as well. Here you see, like, for example, the list of open quotes that a user created. It's not pretty, but the users were really excited about like having quoting, invoicing, usage metering, really like this integration piece that we wanted to test, whether users really want it and whether we can actually build it and where the complexities are. We were able to ship all of this in 2 weeks. Onboarded 10 users on it. We initially had the idea more to test how long it takes to build a real billing engine, which was in the TypeScript extension. Also MVP. Then we're kind of surprised that we could actually sell this and people used it. The goal was to go deeper on the technical problem and get like in very deep conversations with early users. Maybe on the next slide, you can see the extension. This was the interface of what we coded. It was basically just like enter a date for which you want to generate invoices. Then you hit this kind of generate invoice button. And then it took like 5 to 10 seconds, and all the invoices that you needed to send out in the month were created. You had PDF files, and then you can go back to the no-code UI to send them out as like an outbox to manually check. I think we also did like debt collection, so you could see like which invoices you sent, but which weren't paid. Like very broad MVP, which was we were able to ship in 2 weeks due to kind of using these no-code UI elements. I think this was kind of the most interesting MVP that we built, because right now it's more about scoping down and then launching kind of increments to our open source package. But we're really trying not to ship like too much at once and then talk to users again. So this is kind of the most interesting part.
Got it. And how did you decide on the scope here for this one?
Basically, we had these initial users who had the problem, who we talked to each, I think, like 2 times before, and we knew kind of the requirements. And if you want to launch something where you have like 3 very mature software categories and you want to build like a suite that includes all of them, you need to cut on like scope in each of the pillars, because billing has lots of bells and whistles and it's very complicated if you want to serve all edge cases. So we decided to really cut in the depth of each feature and focus on the integration piece, which was what we wanted to innovate on. And then, building CRUD interfaces broad was very easy. Adding like another view for debt collection, if you need to manually kind of check off whether an invoice was paid, that's kind of easy to paint the picture of this is what we could do, because then having the conversation around, yes, we will build a feature to automatically reconcile payments is way easier once you have a UI that a user can actually use. Disclaimer, these were, I would say, below Series B software companies with not like thousands of users. So these kind of manual steps were bearable for them.
Yeah, and at first glance, it seems like you're breaking one of the rules we talked about in the beginning, right? Solving one specific problem or just doing one task. But if I understand correctly, in this case, the integration of it all and having these things in one place is the actual problem that you're solving, in contrast to having like the individual pillars and going deep, at least in the beginning. Is that correct?
Yeah, because that's what we've seen kind of breaking once you want to scale with the current stack.
Yeah.
Like if you want to grow larger, this is where it breaks. I can skip to the conclusion. We'll publish a postmortem in the coming days or weeks. Nice. Around why we pivoted away from what we did back then.
Great, looking forward to it.
Because TLDR is building a suite is kind of hard if you want to kind of gain the depth that's required by more mid-market to enterprise users. We bet basically on that we don't need to build like the full complexity from day one, but then realize that the edge cases that mid-market customers have, they're not homogeneous, and you basically need to catch up on features that existing players built over years. So, you took a couple of months to launch publicly. But in this case, we didn't want to kind of build for 1 or 2 years before launching.
Yeah.
So then decided that we want to solve more niche problems.
Yeah, I can understand that. And there is like some counterexamples of like building long and then like launching at a later date. But usually those successful companies have customers in private that they work with very, very closely. So it's almost never that like at least successful companies just build and don't talk to anyone and then publish something great. That usually doesn't happen. Let's see, in the interest of time, let us talk really quickly about how you define scope, and then we skip over. So I can start. So for us, in the very like early MVP stages, we just think about what are the must-haves, like what is something that we just can't cut, and then what are things that would be great to have. So there's like it's called like Moscow method, I think, where you have like must have, should have, could have, and won't have. Won't have, you just cut. Must have, you can't launch it without it. And should have, if you have time, you can still like squeeze it in, but usually should have is already on the way out. And then when we go a bit deeper later and decide about features once the MVP is live, then we use something similar to the RISE scoring method, where you talk about reach, how many people would be able to use it of your user base or potential user base, impact, how much impact would it have for each of them? Is it like a small thing or a big thing? And then how confident are we in that it actually helps them? And then also you look at what is the effort that you have to put in days or weeks, depending on how big it is. And then you just multiply the first two things through the effort, and then you have like kind of a score. We have like an adapted version of that we use once we like, that's usually like after the initial MVP stage, but that really helps us. How do you talk about scope internally?
Yeah, something very similar. I mean, whenever we are more like an exploratory phase of validating what's like the next thing to add or the next thing to build, it's very much like what's like very key to the problem that the user wants to get solved, and just focus on this, which is basically the must-have. And then, I mean, uncertainty and effort is kind of a dimension as well, for sure.
Yeah, got it. Okay, let's skip to the next one, tools to build. Everyone has their own stack, right? But there's a couple of, like, I would say like leaders in the specific areas. I'll just start with a couple of comments and you can just jump in. And then specifically for the AI stack, I think you have to take over because that's one of your specialties at the moment. So for prototyping and design, I think Figma is still the best one usually. Do you use something else?
No.
Yeah, I think most people that I know use Figma. You can use Sketch or Adobe if you really want to, but I think Figma is the de facto leader. Then for front end, it depends a little on what you're comfortable with, right? It doesn't really matter whether you use React, Angular, Vue, like just depending on what you like. You can also use like a front end builder, like Webflow or like plugins, like Marc said earlier, on top of Notion. Sometimes even a Notion page or just like something very simple can be very helpful. Do you have any preferred stack in the front end, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, we are like all TypeScript and
all
like
TypeScript,
Next.js, because then at some days when we need to make big changes, can basically do like back-end, front-end migrations all at the same time. And maybe for those who are interested, big fan of like the T3 stack, using TRPC to link both. So yeah, I mean, making big changes without having stuff break works as long as you don't have like a public SDK with an API that you need to maintain. That's kind of like a struggle we have currently, that we need to maintain kind of historic API versions, or can make them like break too often. But once you're just building like a SaaS app, Next.js, all TypeScript, TRPC is great.
Nice. Yeah. And then for backend, again, it depends a little on what you're good at. For example, I know some people who are just like really good Python developers because that's what they did for a long time. So they like to use Django. Would I recommend that to someone who has never used Python before? Probably not. I think Node still pretty far up. As you said, like just TypeScript front end and backend has like a lot of advantages. Obviously, like if you want to go faster and are in the initial stages, you can also use like a workflow tool or low-code backend, like make.com or even Fastgen, depending on what you're scoping out. And for the database, it can be a Google Sheets or an Airtable if you start out. I think it really depends on what you're building. Sometimes you just want to have like an actual database. For SQL, I think Supabase is a great option. NoSQL, I would say Firebase is still pretty far up there. Fastgen also has a database if you want to have a combination of things, or you can connect Supabase to Fastgen, which actually a stack I really like when I build things like quickly nowadays. I use Supabase as a database, plug it into Fastgen, then use Fastgen to build out the MVPs and my workflows. And in the front end, it really depends on what I'm focusing on, whether it's mobile or web or whatever. Do you have a preferred database?
We just use Supabase.
Yeah.
I feel like performance isn't kind of the issue usually, and we interact with it via Prisma. Probably also not. Well, we don't optimize for this. Like whatever we know and what we are fast with, we stick with it until it's like the limiting factor to kind of what users want. If that's kind of the bottleneck, then we focus on it. But as long as it isn't, we don't change it.
Yeah, someone just mentioned it in the chat. If you ever use Webflow and Fastgen as a backend, you can use Whist in the middle to build MVPs really quickly. The Whist plus Webflow plus Fastgen stack is something we see often, also partly because we know the Whist founder pretty well. He is actually in he is co-founding a company with one of our previous employees that we worked with at Blair, like the previous fintech. And let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, hosting, really whatever is fast. I think Vercel is something you like.
Yeah, I think this kind of framework defined infrastructure is very interesting.
Yeah.
Because like when we don't have something that's async, we just stick with Next.js API routes, and then it's kind of like we don't need to worry about deployment at all. If it's async, you need to think about it, but as long as it's sync, it's no problem. And then Vercel is great. Probably many people on Twitter will say it's too expensive when you scale. That's kind of happy to pay for speed. Yeah, I agree. You can always optimize later. Yeah, analytics, I really like Postdoc for most things. Just use something that works fast. Let's talk about AI stack a little bit, because I get that question a lot. We have many people who are using Fastgen who are building AI first products and like build their core product on something else and then use Fastgen to like build like the rest of it. Or even like if the MVPs that they're building are ChatGPT based, sometimes they use Fastgen to do it as well. But yeah, I think in terms of AI stack, you're probably a good person. So what do you think is the AI MVP stack? Yeah, probably this will change week over week.
Yeah. What is it this week?
And depends on the kind of application that you want to build. Mm-hmm. If it's like purely chat, then for example, you want to have like this kind of streaming experience on the front end. And I tinkered over the weekend with the Vercel AI framework, just because it's like streaming enabled and very easy to use. Like that, we see many builders for the like typical setups. I don't know, knowledge retrieval, summarization, text generation, maybe classification, just using LangChain and having very rudimentary front ends, where, for example, Streamlit, because it's just then about the AI functionality of the LLM application, not about the front end. So Streamlit works, and you just use LangChain to get there quickly. Maybe you move off of it or customize parts of the agent off the chain down the road. But as a starting point, if you're on the application layer, not innovating on like a new way to use LLMs, really like LangChain is a good starting point. Got it. Okay. And maybe same thing. Many people will talk about like optimizing for the right vector database, or like there's so many things that you can optimize for, or running open source models. I think like back in March, someone was saying no GPUs before product market fit. I like that because I mean, optimizing for performance or for cost depends on the application again, but just using OpenAI or one of the other managed providers makes a lot of sense to get it to users, get to 80% quality, see whether people like it. Probably like fine-tuning won't get you to something people like if non-fine-tuned isn't likable. That's a very specific problem where you need to invest upfront for these kind of standard LLM applications that we see a lot. Yeah, and that is a great transition, because what I heard is go fast
And that's what we're talking about now, which is the actual topic that we were building up for. So how do you actually go fast when you build MVPs? I have a couple of thoughts. Marc has a couple of thoughts. And then from now on, if you have any questions, also just put them in the chat because we might combine it as well. So I think one of the key things whenever you're building product, and it doesn't really matter whether it's an MVP or whether you're shipping new features, is minimizing distractions for the people who are building. And especially if you are a small team or even a solo developer, but even in bigger teams, it's like one of the most important things because you need to protect your focus time of actually shipping things and getting things done. And that is one of the best levers you can have because time is finite, right? So actually my co-founder and CTO mentions that a lot as well. Like whenever we talk about how can we go faster, one of the first things is always minimize distractions. So that's number one. Then, especially when you want to ship an MVP fast, it's helpful if you know the dependencies and it's very clear that you can only ship B after you've built A. Sometimes it's very obvious, but sometimes you need to think about it a little. And I've been in a situation a couple times in the past, not with Fastgen that much, but before that, where at some point we wanted to build something, but then the system that it was dependent on wasn't finished yet. So it's very helpful to have that kind of idea in the head in advance. And now I'm actually talking about planning, which is the fourth point. Even if it's an MVP, planning is super important. And it actually speeds you up when you have a clear plan of what you're building. If you just start building without having a clear plan, you are usually way slower than if you plan in advance. And we didn't talk about it much in the beginning, but scoping out by talking to users and identifying the key things that are really important and then planning them out. It seems slower because you're not actually building, but you will save time if you don't drag it out for way too long, but you will save time if you plan in advance. And then the other thing that I see many people, the mistake that I see many people make is they don't ship MVPs. They ship things that already have, I don't know, 12 features because they think they 100% need it. And then they already optimize the load times or do 5 iterations on the design of the MVP, even though it's not super relevant. So ship actual MVPs. And that's something that you probably only learn over time with the pain of shipping features or products that no one actually wants and having wasted a lot of time, as we talked about earlier. And then sometimes it helps to have users already involved in the building process and then show them maybe a click dummy, show them something that you've already built, try to weave their feedback in so that you're not running in the wrong direction. Because if you can steer while you're building, that can save you a lot of time. And I think you had a couple of points as well on how to go fast.
Yeah, maybe a quick addition in regards to planning. I mean, it depends on the team, but figuring out how you work best. For example, we are usually 2 people shipping, and if you've validated the scope that you want to build and you have kind of the end result in mind, usually for an MVP, the whole mental model should fit in your head. So it's kind of waterfall-y how you implement it. It's not super iterative. Then it's to even minimize distractions or moving it, going to the wrong direction, one of the 2 people building. Really defining these interfaces between you initially, talking them through, and then everyone owns their part of the interface. For example, for many applications in billing or also currently in our observability package, the database schemas, for example, a great kind of thing you can talk through in detail in the beginning, and then everyone owns kind of the implementation details down from there. Just a quick add-on. Yeah, for us, I think biggest learning to go fast was little shout out to Diana from YC, duct tape engineering. Do things that get you fired at big tech. Don't worry about long-term tech debt. As you said, uptime might be irrelevant, depends on the application, but that it a big load test, probably irrelevant, or cleaning up tech debt because it's not modularized. Doesn't matter. I don't know, if you work with a lot with, for example, with TypeScript, and you would need to think a lot about typing if you want to modularize. If you copy paste stuff and have the same code in your code base twice, it doesn't hurt anyone because usually you delete one or both anyway. in the future. So like whatever doesn't break your neck in the next weeks, don't worry about it. Like that's at least our learning. And it's more about like earning the right than by having users who demand it to build it out more nicely before like building it nice because you want it to be nice. Get it out, and then if users use it and you see scale on the feature you built, and like validation on the MVP, then you can still go back and re-engineer it, because probably even if you plan a lot and work a lot on the feature beforehand, you'll rebuild it anyway. At least that's what we've heard from teams there that did this over and over and ran into this mistake. Adding to what I said before, like we had a good like whatever I recommend to others is like picking a stack and stick to it. And I mean, for us, it's like I said, TypeScript, backend, front end, always same database, always same ORM, always Tailwind. It's like maybe we change like one tiny thing from time to time. For example, in the beginning we used for front end Chakra and then moved off to Tailwind. But like never changing too much. That's like there shouldn't be like a learning curve to build something new, at least, and if it's not like required by what you build next. Keeping the goal in mind, just to because like if you define the MVP, maybe there's some kind of features creep still going on. If you're a user coming in saying, oh, I want this, but like getting something out in the first increment, shipping it, and then focusing on the next thing to build based on user feedback, and not like moving the target while kind of wanting to finish the target first, like getting it out, and then you can still add things to it. Yeah, and that's kind of the reducing scope, or having a view on scope that doesn't change while building. That's like I guess the top learnings we had.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so we could talk about like all these different points for much longer, but maybe now we'll just see whether anyone has any questions about their specific cases, about building MVPs in general, about anything else. Honestly, if you have anything that you're interested in right now, just put them in the chat. If not, we might have like 2 minutes to do closing arguments on our end and leave you for the rest of your day. Let's see if something trickles in. I think we had one question earlier about how to build MVPs with LLMs fast that we already answered.
Yeah, by the way, if there's something I can help with, feel free to DM me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Happy to help with like picking the right stack for building with LLMs, especially if you want, as described in the question, like want to add like maybe a new feature to existing product. Like there are some considerations and some best practices for the typical use case, because when adding new features, typically like the typical LLM use cases that we see right now very often. Yeah. Okay, a couple of questions trickling in. First one, for anyone without a technical background, what is the best way to learn how to build an MVP? Any classes/videos that you recommend? I think two-faced answer to that. Number one, you should expect to learn at least some details on how to be more technical. So if you're completely non-technical, it's very difficult. So you need to like dive in a little bit. I think the easiest option is using no-code or low-code tools. So instead of like completely learning how to code, you use Webflow for the front end if you want to build a web app, and then use like if you need a backend, use something like Fastgen in the backend, or if you're even less technical, then you use something like Airtable plus the widgets on top potentially. I haven't done that, but it seems like something that's easier. So it really depends on what you want to build. But yeah, I think starting with lower code options usually leads to more success than completely learning how to actually build technical products, because I've seen too many people just start for a week and then just drop off. If you're very committed, then obviously learning how to code might be the best way to go. What do you think, Marc? Yeah, I guess it depends on the kind of applications or kind of features that you want to build. I've seen many teams kind of build very hacky MVPs. If you're like a marketplace, maybe just like a type form on a website is enough. Building a website is easy. Type form should be doable. Like it's not a technical problem, and the technical problem then comes with scale over time. On the other hand, I would say I would encourage anyone that has like a more longer view on, I want to build stuff and I want to be like the builder, or I want to test things by myself without being dependent on other people. If you're not technical, encourage really to go down the road of like playing with things, because I feel like in 2023, you're standing kind of on the shoulder of giants. So many things are abstracted away from you. It's so easy to build something that's kind of useful because you have so many frameworks to use. And I mean, I have often when I'm like in a territory that I haven't built in before, I could learn the very true fundamentals, but often just like having some Q&A chats with ChatGPT, probably shelling out money for ChatGPT Plus is worthwhile.
Yeah.
But I definitely recommend. It's very easy to get things out, and when you see kind of issues to get quick like errors resolved.
Yeah, for me, for example, I'm pretty good at like backend stuff. I'm not that good at front end stuff. So I use ChatGPT quite a lot whenever I have to build front ends. I just built a website for a friend of mine, and ChatGPT was my best friend. It was a lot of fun, but sometimes you just need to use assistive tools. Do you have an example of an MVP in Fastgen? I assume that means of people who have built MVPs on top of Fastgen. And then, yes, I do have a couple. Let me think what's most interesting. So we do have one company, I think roughly 100 employees, that want to launch a new product. They are in the commercial real estate cleaning sector and now want to launch an additional product that would be a SaaS flow for their users, so that they don't have to like call them, and they do have like a basic web form. But basically, they're testing out, can we build a SaaS product on top of what we're already building, where people could book something and then they would have like an overview of the bookings, etc., and they could also pay through that. So they're building the MVP in that. And then we also have lots of like earlier stage teams and solo makers like build CRUD products on top of Fastgen. One other cool example is like, let's go international. We have a company in Nigeria that is building a lawyer marketplace with Fastgen, which I really like. That was pretty cool. Yeah. How do you choose beta users? How do you find them in the first place, especially if you target larger companies? So how do you choose them? So I think there's two ways to answer the question. Number one, if you already have defined who your core user group is, and you're selling to larger companies, you take everyone you can. You don't really choose. If someone is willing to be a beta user, you just say, yes, thank you. At least if you sell to big companies. The only other option is you have like way too much demand, which would be a great problem to have, but usually you don't have that in the beginning. So I think let's reframe it. And how do you find the right beta users? Let's say you're selling to a specific type of company, and then I think it's a mix of really understanding the problem by talking to those people, and then it's a lot of work through introductions, cold emails, iterations, finding people who have that problem that you're trying to solve, and then convincing them that using your product, even if it's in the very early stages, actually helps them solve that product. But it's a very hard iterative process, and it's usually never easy. What do you say, Marc?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we mostly do introductions if we want to go up market or talk to people up market to see how they have solved the problem, because usually, like if you work in like a nascent space, then, for example, talking to people at big tech companies helps to understand like, how does this problem like scale with scale? Like, how does it grow? How do people solve it with current tools? How do they solve it if they have great engineering talent to already solve it? And is this problem still there when they are big? And we prefer introductions because it's the best way. But other than that, we do cold outreach via email, very targeted, or via Twitter, if people kind of self-identify themselves that they are working on the problems that we solve. I mean, targeting engineers, they do product announcements sometimes, or the product managers. So because like for larger companies, it's very difficult to get to really the one person who is in charge of the problem that you try to solve. But that's kind of the way we are headed. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Maybe quick addition to beta user. I think like a big learning for us was not framing it as like a beta, but framing it as like I understand the one problem that you have. my product solves it, and it's great to be a first user because you have me on Slack Connect. I'll go above and beyond to fix it for you. Like, trust me, I'll do it for you. And even if it's like, even if I need to do something manual late at night, I don't care. Trust me, I'll solve your problem. And this is the kind of product. I mean, you need to tell me what you want, what the problem is. If I decide that I want you as a user because it fits to what I want to build, then it should feel great to be a first user, not feel like as a guinea pig.
Yeah, and again, this depends on what you're building, because if you're building a backend that literally needs uptime to work, you can't say that.
You can't fake it.
Yeah, but if you're actually building like a product that you sell to non-technical people and try to help them solve a business problem, then often you can actually get away with a lot of like manual intervention. And I've done that myself in the past, and it's very, very helpful. There, it's just almost, you don't sell the product only, you sell the product and your own skills and like some kind of service component of just saying, well, I'll do everything to make you happy. That's how I would frame it.
Yeah, for us currently, it's kind of both, because our observability package that developers use, that needs to be very high quality, because I mean, what would be the worst thing that can happen? That our great observability package, which helps them if it works, kind of breaks their production app if we have kind of a bug. That is never allowed to happen. Like if something on our end breaks, then maybe something isn't tracked, but the production app is not allowed to break at all.
Yeah.
But for example, now when we're thinking more about like what to do with the data and generating like interesting insights, then you can go about like building things for single enterprise clients to figure out like what's like the one thing they really need, and there you can go this kind of more manual route. But not for, it's in the engineering process, it's deployed in production. The quality bar needs to be very high.
Yeah, I agree. There's things that can break and things that can't break or shouldn't break. Maybe before we go to the last question, quick announcement that we have another webinar coming up, or like a lot of other webinars coming up. One that is already announced is how to build products that get funded. So if any of you are looking to get investors in the future, I'm talking to a fellow founder friend of mine who's now building his second venture-funded company. And we will talk about what do investors care about, especially in the early days. What do you need to show them to get money? So if you're interested in that, feel free to sign up. And then we will have other things coming up, like designing. Like I'll talk to one of my favorite designer friends. We'll talk about security for your applications. So lots of cool things coming. But yeah, maybe as a last question, because Marc is very busy and has to ship things, which AI assistant would you recommend to create code/SQL queries? Just ChatGPT or something else? So for me personally, I mostly just use ChatGPT Plus when it comes to both code and SQL queries. I tried a couple of other things, but I haven't really found anything that amazes me so much that it is so much better than what ChatGPT Plus or like GPT-4 can do. What about you?
Yeah, I'm using Copilot a lot in VS Code. Like when it's incremental and where it's like, it just like, I think this metric that they disclosed, like what share of code that people who use Copilot is actually Copilot code. I think it was like over 50% or around 50%. I can totally agree, because lots of the boilerplate thing is just generated, which is very nice to move fast.
Yeah.
But then for the bigger things, or where I want to manually create context and be like, oh, this is how it's currently, I want to move into this direction, they're currently manually copied to just ChatGPT Plus. I tried Copilot X from Microsoft, but I still kind of prefer manually defining, this is the context, this is my goal, and then getting it out of ChatGPT. Yeah,
Copilot in VS Code is great. And then even like SQL, I like ChatGPT is just so much better at SQL than I am. I like SQL specifically.
I'm currently wondering like how much they could actually charge for Copilot. Like currently it's like so underpriced.
Yeah, but don't tell them. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Special thanks to Marc for sharing your insights.
Thanks for the invite.
It was a pleasure as always. If you're building an LLMs, you should chat with Marc. If you want to spin off your backends really quickly, you should give Fastgen a spin. And yeah, have a good rest of your day, depending on where you are. I see some people from Europe. Enjoy the rest of your evening. There's some people that got up early on the West Coast in the US. So I hope you have a great day as well. And yeah, bye everyone.